Welcome to part number 2. So today we're talking about Greek myths, and I have a little friend here that I'm holding up, and it's a little statue, a tiny little statue of an owl. And this owl um, I bought when I was in Mexico City a long time ago. But I also bought another owl, and I have a tendency to collect owls. And that's where we're going to get started with this collection of owls. So I have a tendency to collect owls, and I bought an owl when I was traveling through Greece when I was much younger. I traveled by myself through the islands of Greece and Athens and Crete and Turkey as well. When I went to Samos and a few of the islands, and I saw some of the architecture that's there in what was Troy, and did a little bit of walking around and learning about these different physical sites of antiquity. And what I did was in Athens, I bought Greece, I bought a tiny little owl. And I don't have that tiny owl here because I gave it to my sister. And what I do is I go to my sister's house, and she has the little owl with a few other mementos from other people and gifts and places that she's traveled. And some of those mementos I stop at and I look at, but that one especially, the little owl. And that's where I'm going to start today, is with this curiosity, where we individually, you watching this, me, and countless hundreds of thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of different people. And that is the story of the personal experience of an ancient story or an ancient symbol. Now, the owl in antiquity comes from a number of different owl stories, and you might be familiar with a few of those in your own culture. But I always found, looking at the owl from Athens, the little owl, that it made me reflect on ideas of a symbol and story. And it made me think about what an owl actually is and how I appropriate that owl. I take that owl and I make up my own new understanding of what that owl is, given its situation in history as a symbol. In Athens, the owl is always seen with Minerva, with Athena, and the owl represents certain traits. Many of the traits that Athena herself as a god is often representing: wisdom and knowledge, right? Wit and curiosity. Those are some of the symbolic meanings that we gather from the Athenian owl. And you might even see that owl on coins from Greece. You will see obviously many statues, most depicting Athena with the owl, and a few with the owl by itself, because it becomes self-referential, becomes a story about itself. And I look at that owl, and I remember going to Greece. I was much younger, and I remember going to Greece and seeing that owl, picking it up, holding it in my hands. I was in a museum, probably a museum bookstore, and I was surrounded by all of this history, this ancient history that spoke about the owl. And I held it, and it was cool, and it was made out of clay. And I could feel it, and I could tell just by feeling it and looking at it and experiencing it that it came with all of this rich history symbolically. But it also comes, and it reminded me of another history, another story, and that is about how I viewed owls growing up and how my family grew up understanding what owls meant symbolically. And it was very different from the owl of Athena. In my culture, Mexican American, Chicana, Mesoamerican cultures, as well as some native cultures, Uh, the owl represents and has always represented death, a foreboding, an omen, or change, not just death, but maybe change. And there was always suspicion that came along with viewing the owl. But I always loved owls. And my father used to tell me these stories about the owl, and we would call him tecolotes. And he would say, when he was little and he was living out in New Mexico, and he would go and stay with his grandparents who lived way out in the llano, way out in the far reaches of the land where no one else was living, in a little rickety old adobe house, and he'd have to sleep on the wood floors, or on the wooden porch in the summers to keep cool. They would all tell him stories. The family and grandparents and aunts and uncles, and probably a few mean cousins, would tell him stories about the tecolotes, and that they, if you saw one, they had these magical abilities. You know, they could take children, but most of the time they were omens of things to come. And usually those omens were of major change, destruction, or death. And so my father always told me these stories about the tecolotes and the owls, or bull, the owls, and they were always these kind of negative stories. But when I reached for that owl, I picked it up in that museum in Athens, and I understood owls with multiple reasons, right? Symbolically, they meant a lot of different things to me. And I was adding, as I was learning about the Athenian owl, I was learning about how the stories of the past, of our ancestry, can be added, and we can create a new way of looking at something symbolically. If our connotations allow, right? If our connotations, which is basically the ideas and concepts around a word that bubble up around the surface, right? Our connotations, whether positive or negative or both, can give us a new understanding of what that image is. And so I wanted to start with that little story of the owl, because that's one of the first times that I really started to get interested and become interested in concepts of the ancient, and of ancient symbol, as well as ancient stories. And that's where we start with, right, at the beginning of this class. We start at the beginning of this class with this idea, this concept of these ancient stories that we call myths, and we call them classical myths in this class. We're going to define what that means, and we're going to find, you're going to find that throughout the semester, we're going to continually, just like we're doing with the owl, we're going to continually build on our definitions of mythology, because mythology is a word that we create in order to understand the stories that are ancient, stories that are brought down through generation and generation and generation, usually orally, right? And then written down eventually. And mythology is a way for us to start to excavate, to pull apart, like the skin of an onion, right? To pull apart the different parts of a story, to try and understand, number one, what does it mean for us now, but also how does it give us a glimpse into a world that is very old and very ancient, and something that we haven't seen before, and we may never experience. And I think that that's part of what that interest in it was. So mythology has quite a few different definitions, and I would be not doing my job if I just gave you one definition and had you memorize that. I'll give you a few, and I'm going to give you a working definition of what we're actually, talking about when we talk about myths and classical myths. Let's start with classical, because I think that might be a little bit of an easier definition. But basically, classical myths are myths that, classical would be in reference to the literature of the ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And with that, also, there's a definition of classic that is any language that's notable, right, for excellence and quality of the writer's works. So we have on one hand a pretty definitive definition. Classics usually means Greek and Roman, ancient Greek and Roman for that matter. And classic also means all of the other stuff, worthy of retelling and writing down. So on two hands, we have different definitions already of a pretty simple way of defining a word. But that's what I'd like us to think about in terms of classical, because classical is really about, number one, Greek and Roman, right, literature, the major works especially. And it's also giving some, or pointing to, maybe not giving, but pointing to an idea that there are more than just the Greek and Roman myths, and more than just Greek and Roman literature that is important to consider and to read and to study. And that takes us to our idea or concept of mythology. So Greek and Roman mythology is primarily what we will be discussing in this class. These are the Greek and Roman myths, especially the Greek myths, that you're probably pretty familiar with, at least in terms of the very surface or brief and most maybe interesting, maybe not the most interesting, maybe the most poignant, maybe not poignant, maybe the most written about and discussed Greek myths. Things like Prometheus, Pandora, Zeus and his thunder and lightning bolts. All of those become this kind of like Greek mythology that we are already familiar with. But mythology is also a world mythology. And so a lot of times we think of myths as being static and never changing, but in fact, it's the opposite, right? Myths are constantly changing. So let's get a little definition down of myth. Myth definition number one. I wrote it down here in my notes. Myth is a story that has meaning and significance beyond the story itself. I like that definition. Myth is a story that has meaning and significance beyond the story itself. It's a pretty broad and some people might argue vague definition of myth. And it doesn't take into account a lot of the types of stories that we're going to read. But I do like it. Myth is not a religion, so let's point to that first. It's not a religion. Well, religion involves like beliefs and rituals, bodily practices, history, institutions, normative value systems, faith, belief. All of these things surround religion. And myth, instead of being religious in nature, which it's attached to and associated with, let's think about it instead as myth draws on religion and religious tradition, right, through its stories. All right, okay, so myth is a story that has meaning and significance beyond the story itself. Myth is not religion. However, instead, it draws on religious traditions. Myth is, I think, storytelling, and I'm going to refer to it and think about it as storytelling this semester. Myth is storytelling. What does that mean? What is a story? Okay, so I gave you a story earlier, the story about me being in a a nice little museum and finding an owl, and the recollections of what that owl symbolically means to me in my culture, or my culture where I'm coming from. Uh, and then adding to that, the story of or the symbolism of the owl within ancient Greek culture. So that gave you a story. I think that that's what a myth does. A myth sets us up in a specific place and time. It gives us characters, often supernatural characters, but sometimes it's a story about a hero. Sometimes it's a story about a human. And sometimes it's not supernatural at all, but it's mythic. And mythic also sometimes means extreme or large, like like the mythos, extreme or large. But it is story, and it's storytelling. Myth is storytelling that provides an explanation, right, for various cultural elements, right? It gives origin, purpose, and value to those cultural elements. So myth is a story that has meaning and significance beyond the story itself. Instead of being religious, myth draws on religious tradition. Myth is storytelling. It provides an explanation for various cultural elements. It gives origin to, purpose to, and value to those cultural elements. So with that, we get a first real definition of myth. And I'd like you to think about those things, those ideas, and your concepts of myth and what you think of as myth. A lot of times people say that myth is a story that's fake or untrue. But to me, that holds a negative connotation. I think that there are many stories that have truths to them. And to say a story is made up of untrue elements seems subjective and overly negative. And so I don't think of myth necessarily as a story that's fake or untrue. Though the belief systems that surround many myths helped to explain natural phenomenon that later on we had other ways to find out and figure out through science and the scientific method, that those stories, even though they had an origin story of something, this natural phenomenon can be explained scientifically. Okay. And that is a huge discussion as well, right? Because that takes into consideration this idea that a myth gives all of the answers. And a myth can give all of the answers to a specific society. Myth is a type of reality, and it sure as heck was a reality when it was being told to a specific culture that believed those things to be true, especially because it was probably interconnected with their religious traditions, their life, everything around them. They breathed, ate, slept, lived, all with these myths being true to them and being their reality. So it really became a way to describe their reality. And that, I think, is kind of an interesting idea, because quite a few of you, and I'll do some shout outs, but quite a few of you wrote about how you're interested in myth as being this way into seeing what it was like to live in an ancient culture. And because many of these cultures just lived that myth as a reality, it helps to give us an idea, although sometimes a very fleeting or surface idea of what it might have been like to live at that time. All right. I have some more quotations that I want to give to you that quotations or from other sources. I'll let you know where those sources are coming from. But I wanted to read to you from an introduction to the encyclopedia. An introduction to the encyclopedia by Robert Graves. And the introduction is written by Robert Graves, who is a historian. And I'm going to read to you from this. And it's an explanation of what his definition of mythology is in this introduction to an encyclopedia with many different myths. This isn't from either of your books, but it's a pretty interesting book to take a look at, and it's called the Encyclopedia of Mythology, and he introduces it. He says, myth has two main functions. The first is to answer the sort of awkward questions that children ask, such as, who made the world? How will it end? Who was the first man? Where do souls go after death? The answers, necessarily graphic and positive, confer enormous power on the various deities credited with the creation and care of souls, and incidentally, on their priesthoods. The second function of myth is to justify an existing social system and account for traditional rights and customs. So he gives an example here. The Erechtheid clan of Athens, who used a snake as an amulet, preserved myths of their descent from King Eryxthonius, a man-serpent, son of the smith god Hephaestus, and foster son of the goddess Athena. The Euxids of Caira explained their veneration for rushes and wild asparagus by a story of their ancestress Peregrine, whom Theseus the Erechtheid courted in a thicket of these plants, thus incidentally claiming cousinship with the Attic royal house. The real reason may have been that wild asparagus stalks and rushes were woven into sacred baskets, and therefore they were taboo. Myths of origin and eventual extinction vary according to climate, right? In the cold north, the first human beings were said to have sprung from the licking of frozen stones by a divine cow named Adumla. And the northern afterworld was a bare, misty, featureless plain where ghosts wandered, hungry and shivering. According to a myth from the kinder climate of Greece, a titan named Prometheus, kneading mud on a flowery riverbank, made human statuettes, which Athena, who was once the moon goddess, Neith, brought to life. And Greek ghosts went to a sunless, flowerless underground cavern. These afterworlds were destined for serfs or commoners. Deserving nobles could count on warm celestial mead halls in the north and Elysian fields in Greece. Myths of origin and eventual extinction, right, have a function, and that's to justify, according to Graves, to justify an existing social system and account for traditional rights and customs. So two different definitions. And that's where we're led, okay? So that's where we're led with the first major definition. And then the second definition, quotation by Robert Graves, is that myths help us to understand the world, right, better. Help us to understand why we do things a certain way. And even in our own culture, if you can call it that. And I know that there's a lot of discussion about what American culture is. And maybe we'll even get a chance to discuss a little bit of that as well. But American culture has a mythos. If we think about it, we put specific people in places of prominence. We idolize popular artists, musicians, people that are on television or are actors that are in movies. And we also venerate heroes that do individually do things heroically for the country. We create stories that surround us about who we are, what we believe, why we believe it. And that is creating a mythos, right? So myth, ancient or current, is a way, right, for us to justify the system that we're living in. And we continue those myths. The real question is going to be, how did these myths get so powerful? The ancient Greek myths, so incredibly powerful that other cultures adopted their myths. The Romans, in fact, adopted and changed the names of most of the major mythical characters from ancient Greece. And I think that that's one of the most intriguing questions, is what makes these myths so powerful? So powerful that thousands and thousands of years later, we're sitting in a classroom, or we're sitting virtually at home or on the bus, and we're listening to somebody talk about the power of these old stories. Well, there's something really important to them. And that's going to be the question of this semester. One of the big questions is why? Why Greek myths? Why are they so powerful? What is encased in their stories that really makes us want to adopt and listen to and continue the stories? Maybe with our own additions, maybe with our own questions, but always with a curiosity to what was before. And that's where I want to stop for today, is I want to really have some time for you to think about definitions of myth and to think about where you came from, right? Your preconceived ideas about myth. So I'm going to be asking you some questions today online. One of those is going to be, what is your preconceived idea of myth? What are myths to you? Okay. Of course, they're going to be individualized definitions, and that's okay, because we don't necessarily add those to this large mythos methodology and definitions, but we do want to try to start to uncover, dig up, and understand what our own definitions, our preconceived ideas of myth are, especially with Greek myth, because there's movies out there, right? Probably every one of you has watched the Clash of the Titans, maybe even the original Clash of the Titans that came out in the 1980s. You definitely have watched something, right, from that uses Greek mythology. You might be really interested in the books of Greek mythology as they were written and retold in Percy Jackson, right, and the Olympians. So all of those things are surrounding us, and I want you to be thinking about those things tonight. What is it also? What is it that draws you to myth? What is it that drives you? What's pulled you to this course when you could take other courses on literature? What was it when you were young that pulled you to the myths? Was there a story that was particular to you that you read and you got something from that just excited you or interested you? What was it that drew you to myth? And how have popularizing and popular new creations of the old myth stories, how have they created a myth bias for you? How have they created a way for you to see myths and think about myths? And can that be problematic? Why? We'll talk about more of those things later. But I want you to stop with the video in a minute and just really think about these definitions. And I'll provide some of the definitions for you online. I'd also like you to get started on some of the myths by reading from the anthology of mythology that that is one of the books for this semester. To get us started, I'm also going to have you start to look at Hesiod and Hesiod's theogony. Hesiod is an author, an ancient author, and I'm going to have you read a little bit about Hesiod. An ancient author, very ancient, of Greek mythology, both about the gods, the Olympian gods, as well as the regular humans and the peasant class that he wrote about. So we're going to talk about all of those, and we're going to get started next week on the primordials, the Titans, as well as the Olympians. All right, so I think that's what I have for you today. I'll be adding some more stuff for you to take a look at, but I want us to just start to investigate those definitions of myth for ourselves. I'll talk to you soon. Have a really great day. Bye-bye.